Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
In the last episode, I was talking with Katie Wardrobe of Midnight Music, and she mentioned an online tool that is a great way to experiment with rhythm patterns called Groove Pizza. I wanted to pick up on this and talk a bit more broadly about the approach it uses, grid notation for rhythm. One thing that puts a lot of musicians off traditional music notation is the rhythm side of things. The idea of each note having a vertical position representing pitch seems simple enough, and although it's not as simple as it could be, the pitch side of things doesn't take too long to get the hang of. But what makes traditional notation seem so complicated is mostly the rhythm side of things. Every note length has a different symbol, and there can be added complications with dots and rests and all kinds of things, which visually don't make it obvious what the rhythm pattern is. At least not until you've really mastered the notation and learned to sight read it quickly. So for quite some time, there's been an alternative, which is particularly popular among electronic musicians who create music using software tools and often don't have any background in learning traditional notation. When it comes to putting notes into a tool like Logic, Ableton, or GarageBand, traditional notation may be available, but the default is what's called piano roll notation. It's called that because it's based on the system that old mechanical player pianos used, in which holes or dots on a rolled-up piece of paper indicated which notes to play when. It's a really simple system. It's a grid. The vertical position indicates pitch, semitone by semitone, and the horizontal position indicates timing, and so the length of a note is represented by how long that note's marker is. This makes it a very natural visual equivalent to the patterns we hear. We'll have some examples of this in the show notes to make it clear. There are definitely limitations to piano roll notation, but one area where it excels is rhythm. If you're programming a drum beat, for example, it can be incredibly helpful to see it in this grid form, because percussion parts are often regular, systematic, and repeated, which the grid system is perfect for. Now, I have to confess, when I first encountered piano roll and grid notation, I already knew traditional notation, and I thought this was just the kind of for dummies version. Something you would use because you didn't know how to write music properly, or because the software required you to, but it wasn't something that real musicians would find useful. I was totally wrong. Spending some time with piano roll and putting rhythms into a grid gave me a whole new perspective on how rhythm works in music, and it is incredibly useful for developing your musicality on the rhythm side of things. I'm going to talk through a simple example of using Groove Pizza to build up and then experiment with a drum beat. Since it's quite a visual thing we're discussing, I'll put screenshots of each rhythm pattern in grid notation into the show notes. Or you can follow along yourself using Groove Pizza. We'll put a link to that in the show notes too at musicalitypodcast.com. But I think it will be interesting for you just to listen along as well, because part of why I love grid notation for musicality training is that it helps you build up a mental model of how all the beats and subbeats fit together, quite differently to how traditional notation gets you thinking about it. To me, the big difference is this. With traditional notation, you naturally think in terms of a sequence of notes. The timing of each note depends on the timing and duration of the notes that came before it. You do get a kind of reset at the start of each bar where you can see clearly where 1 is. But for the rest of the bar, you kind of need to go note by note to know how it all fits together. With grid notation, you instead can look at the whole bar at once, or even several bars. And each note can be placed directly into the position it should occupy. Or if you're looking at a pattern, you can immediately see when that note happens, regardless of what notes have come before. That makes it perfect for understanding patterns like drum beats, because if we say the kick drum falls on beats 1 and 3, we can see that immediately. If we want to see what happens if the snare drum hits a delayed by half a beat, we can just shift them, and it's immediately visually clear what's going on. Now, again, I should say, This isn't stuff you can't do in traditional notation. It's just much more visually obvious in grid notation, and that can make it much more easy and fun to experiment with, and it builds up a really useful different way of imagining rhythms in your mind and interpreting them with your ears. So let's dive into an example. With Groove Pizza, by default you get a pattern of 16 slices. Now, I should mention this tool gets its name from giving you a fun circular representation of your rhythm too, and that's why it's called pizza and they call it a slice. But below that, you do have the standard grid notation, and that's what we'll be talking about. With 16 possible note timings, you can interpret that as being a single bar of 16th notes, or if you slow down the tempo, it could be 2 bars of 8th notes, or even 4 bars of quarter note beats. We're going to set the tempo to a slow one, just 50 BPM, and that will let us play around with 8th note patterns and still have it be slow enough to hear what's going on. Let's start out simple, putting the kick drum on beats 1 and 3 for 2 bars. You can count that as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm emphasizing the beats where the kick drum falls, but still counting the others out loud, just so that you can hear the 4/4 beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's introduce the snare on 2 and 4, which gives us a pretty standard rock pattern. One thing I should mention is that this particular tool doesn't give you control over each note's volume. So normally if we were actually creating music, we'd be emphasizing certain beats to give a more musical feel, but for these examples, all the volumes will be the same. Now there's one part missing from our standard rock beat, and that's our hi-hat cymbal playing straight eighths, meaning it plays 8 eighth notes in each bar, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So this is where it starts to get interesting. In traditional notation, this looks pretty clear and sensible, easy enough. We'll put the image of that traditional notation in the show notes so that you can compare it with the grid notation. But now we can start to play around, and each of our 3 drum parts is totally independent of what's going on in the others. So what if we throw in an extra kick drum hit before the 3? Or an extra kick after the 3. Or we could try delaying the snare hit on 4 half a beat to put it on the and of 4 instead. What if instead of filling with hi-hat 8th notes, we try just putting in a few to give some of those same offbeat effects without actually moving the kick or the snare at all? Now, if you're familiar with traditional score notation, then you can probably imagine as you listen to this how complicated it might get to write down or try to sight read these slightly less regular patterns. And we're just using 8th notes. With 16th notes, things can get really messy. With grid notation, all of these are super simple to create or to interpret. One of my favorite features of Groove Pizza is how it handles swung rhythms. You can actually see the effect of swinging the beat. Now, I assume you're familiar with the idea of swung rhythms, where everything just sounds a bit more fluid, cool, and jazzy. But literally what it means is that instead of each beat being divided into 2 equal halves to form its 2 subbeats, we split it into 1 long and 1 short subbeat. So instead of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, we get 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. With Groove Pizza, as you increase the swing factor, you can actually see the impact. Every other slice gets shifted right a little bit, so that you can see that pattern of long, short, long, short. This makes it super intuitive to take a pattern like this one we've been playing around with, and understand what's going on in the swung version. It's immediately obvious that the kick and the snare aren't actually affected at all because they fall on the beat. But every other one of our 8th note hi-hat hits are off the beat, and so they get delayed a little and create that long-short pattern. Hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how grid notation can be interesting, different, and useful. If it's new to you, then don't worry, I wouldn't expect you to fully understand it just from this short description, especially if you haven't yet checked out the images in the show notes. But hopefully it does inspire you to go and play around with a tool like Groove Pizza, GarageBand, or another music sequencer. Piano roll and grid notation are not just an overly simplified way of entering music into a computer. They're actually a really valuable alternative representation of how rhythmic patterns are constructed. And once you internalize this way of thinking about rhythm, you're going to have a much better ability to recognize and understand the rhythms you hear, as well as more easily creating your own interesting rhythms. So if you're looking for a new way to develop your ear for rhythm, give grid notation a try.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.